Welcome to the Marketing Trail Guide Podcast, Season 1, Opportunities in Crisis. I'm your host, Kevin Krusiewicz, founder of Marketing Trail Guide and fractional chief marketing officer for companies running on the Entrepreneurial Operating System, or EOS. This is episode 6, Adaptable Humanity, and my guest is Carey Ransom, entrepreneur, executive, investor, and advisor, and president of OC4 Venture Studio, a new technology entrepreneur-focused startup studio and fund in Orange County, California. Carey and I spoke on May 4th of this year, and we talked about something called information asymmetry as a way to identify new opportunities. We talked about thinking like an app, and we talked about perhaps the most vital business competency right now, adaptability. So please sit back and enjoy my interview with Carey Ransom. Carey, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Sure, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Well, Carey, let's just get started in our conversation together. Maybe you could just give us the quick, get us up to speed on what OC4 Venture Studios is and how does it operate?
Sure. So I would call OC4 the culmination of the last couple decades of work that I've been doing. And as you sort of introduced, I've been involved in such a variety of different companies, from inception, from repositioning or turnaround, from early figuring out exactly what business we should be in, to growth stages and everything in between. And now after the last 20 years, I've had just such a set of broad experiences and as I would say, pattern recognition that few people actually get to experience. And as I started to really think more and more about that and find that as I go into a lot of these early stage companies, I'm drawing not from a past experience, but from several and several different scenarios. And I think that's created an adaptability that a lot of folks just don't have. And so as I started thinking about that and its ability to really add value to early stage founders in a more parallel way, that led me on an exploration last year that ultimately culminated in launching OC4 back in November. And really the core idea there is that startup founders need way more than capital to make a business successful. And while a lot of them have that kind of fake it till you make it approach and say, I've got it all figured out, I just need this amount of capital to seed the business and then we'll be fine. I've found through my own experiences that it is never a straight line. It often is way harder and way longer and way more expensive to get these things going. And the real goal of OC4 is to much more predictably ensure success. And so when we deploy capital into the company, we also surround the founding team with a whole group of very experienced, collaborative experts in various areas that are going to be critical to them, such as product and data, technology, and then eventually areas like growth and maybe sales, and very much drawing upon this cultural value set that we've put together here. And when we find the right kinds of founders, we think we can make magic together and we can help them navigate the challenges and the invariable decision making that has to happen in those early stages, focus on the things that matter, and as I said, have much more predictable outcomes towards success. And so we started back in November. We've made several investments and have started to put our team into these companies on the early foundational level to really set the right kind of discipline and foundation in the early stages, make us much more capital efficient. And that's actually turned out to be a really positive thing in an environment like we're in right now. And so we feel like we have started it under the right set of premise. We weren't trying to establish this growth at all costs kind of approach, but really about establishing discipline toward building great businesses and helping founders navigate that process in the early stages to set them up to have much more likely successful outcomes down the road.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't explicitly talk about this, but in your email signature, you mentioned this idea of bringing capital, coaching, collisions, and community to OC Tech entrepreneurs. You talked around a lot of those issues. And so kind of what I hear you saying is a more holistic approach rather than just an injection of cash.
Yes.
And you also talked about the right.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you talked about the right kinds of companies. What are those? What's that profile for you?
Sure. So the way that we think about, our focus is on what we would call data-centric SaaS businesses. So we really like the profile of software-heavy companies that could be explicitly software that you are out licensing, selling into the market, or services that a software foundation is enabling. And we tend to be very data-centric in that we believe still today, very few software companies, very few businesses are properly using data in the most strategic ways possible. So if they haven't established an early strategy around data, then they may have some, but it could be garbage, right? Mm-hmm. The true garbage in, garbage out problem does still exist very broadly. And when you have a good data strategy up front, then you're going to have it structured and collected and have the potential to utilize it in much more impactful ways. So that could lead to better outcomes for your customers through personalization, prediction, recommendation, and then ultimately we have a strong appetite for things like machine learning and artificial intelligence as well. But my experience after doing this for so long is that tends to be a continuum, and it tends to be an evolution that you start, for example, with some, call it expert level types of rules and premises that start to get better over time when you have the right data strategy that can inform a learning algorithm. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of the right kind of core business structure that we like. The types of founders that we're looking for are ones that we can either convince or that really can show up with this idea of humility and collaboration and coachability. Mm-hmm. The ones that need to make every single decision in the business, that have difficulty distinguishing different types of decisions for their value and weight in the success or risk in the business, are not the types of founders that we're seeking. We're seeking ones that understand company building as a team sport and understand in the early stages that key decisions such as product, really understanding that you have the right problem identified that you're trying to solve, mm-hmm. that it's a problem worth solving, meaning people are willing to pay for it in some way. Those are the kinds of founders that we're looking for, and the ones that want help with that, but also understand that's the critical area to really focus on in the early stages, and are willing to let a lot of the, what I call necessary, not strategic aspects of business be done by others, whether that's us or offloaded to others who can take that on, because those ultimately can be big distractions when you're really trying to figure out, do I understand my customer deeply? Do I have an ability to compete in the market in a unique way by solving the problem better? Mm-hmm. And is there a real business opportunity here?
So, man, I have a lot of questions based on all that you just said, and we can go in a couple different directions, but let's just dig in on this idea of sort of market-driven product development for a second. There's one way of doing things, which is let's create a product and then go sell it and market it. And the other way of doing it is let's market something and find out what the market wants and then build it, build the MVP on that basis. Is it that sort of black and white of a dichotomy? Is there a more of a symbiotic relationship? Like, how do you see the interplay between understanding your market and yet coming to market with something? And is it linear like that?
Sure, it's a good question. I think for a lot of people it is linear and or binary. Mm-hmm. Either we go build it and we tell people what they should want, and and we got to go find the people that we can convince to want this. Or, and I think where we tend to really orient is, as I say often, I'm looking for people who can fall in love with the problem. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I've gone so far in a couple of cases to encourage potential founders who say, I'm thinking I really want to go start something. I've said, go think about the kind of customer that you would love to wake up today knowing that you're serving, that you're working with.
The who is just as important, maybe more so than the what.
And it could be, right? Yeah. I think the reality is there's not just one way. Yeah. But I tend to be a risk manager. And again, after I've done this for so long in so many different ways, I've met founders who had the product already built, only to quickly realize this isn't a real problem and there really isn't a market here. And we can try to pivot it to go find another problem. We're the hammer looking for nails.
Right.
Or let's go understand the customer at a depth that we can identify a problem really worth solving with that customer segment. And I think that's what I found is a much more predictable success, is doing it that way, as opposed to this sort of guessing and hoping you land in the right place, or really fully trusting your instincts. And I think the market-driven approach still requires a lot of instinct, and I like it because it doesn't solely require instinct. It also allows you to collect real data and be objective. And so even when I meet founders who already have built the product, I will challenge them to go do some market data collection, to do some market analysis. And I said, look, at best, it just validates that you're right.
Sure.
At worst, it could save you a bunch of time from chasing an opportunity that isn't real. And so to me, it's sort of like the way I think about a lot of early stage forecasts is I think you should do both, meaning you should do a top down. Is this a huge market that we should be competing in? And what could that look like top down? But also do a bottoms up and see if you can find something that lands in the middle. And so just like not having one data point to drive all of your decisions, I think that idea, even to your question of sort of doing a little bit of both is probably the healthiest way to go about building a product and building a company. And we just find that far too often people don't do the market-driven approach.
Yeah, so a couple things come to mind. One of my favorite things, I don't know if I got this from somebody else or if it originated in my own brain. It's probably somebody else's, but product market fit is where startups go to die. And you watch the zig and the zag, and chasing revenue from this influential or the shiny object of the day. And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 years later, you're out of runway and you don't have traction, and then you're having a hard time lining up any more investors, and you strip down to a skeleton crew, or you close the doors because you're just, you've run out of time, you run out of money. Pragmatic marketing or they're now called Pragmatic Institute, sort of a product and marketing framework. And so one of their isms is, there's plenty of experts in the building. We don't need product experts in the building. We need market experts, and those people are out of the building. And another one of their isms is your opinion, although interesting, is irrelevant. And so that kind of goes along with some of the things that you were describing. Markets change, as we know recently. We are in the middle of this COVID crisis. COVID land here. And so what was important 2 months ago is maybe not important anymore, or the emphasis has changed. And so I want to dig into that issue a little bit, especially where, I have a number of friends that are founders, and one founder said to me recently, hey, our whole B2B approach focusing on this institutional education is now at a standstill. Do we lay off, extend our runway, hunker down, and wait it out for that to normalize and stick with our original go-to-market? do we pivot or do we, allocate or do a micro pivot or some experimentations over in B2C? I don't know if there's a one answer for that, but how are you coaching the folks that are in your portfolio to be thinking about decisions like that right now in COVID?
Yeah, great question. So I think the way we've approached it is, the first thing that we did with all of our companies, and you have to remember, our companies are almost all pre-revenue, pre-even launch on product.
Okay.
And so they're early and they're really lean. And I'll be honest, I feel very fortunate that we're in that position right now, because we're still in a very agile spot. And the first thing we did is really look out and say, okay, is the core problem different that we were trying to solve? And we're trying to predict the future. Do we think that is going to be wildly different? And so as an example, I try to use extreme examples at times. We weren't doing anything in the travel industry around cruises, let's say.
Right.
If we were, that I would say very, very radical change that we probably need to make. And so we really looked through a new lens and said, okay, in the near term and longer term, is there a truly structural change that's happened that we need to reorient to? And I think what we've seen with ours is that isn't necessarily the case, and partly because we really have invested around big problems that we think have long-term change that is likely to.
These aren't cottage industry problems.
Yeah, and less about exactly knowing at this stage. We're investing in, let's go on the journey to go find it.
Okay.
And so I think it just further evidences why a much more market-driven, or what I would even call like a jobs-driven approach. Core jobs tend to be really stable over time. And so if you think about an education job as an example, this idea of people needing to get educated in a certain area of life or a certain skill set or something, like that core job tends to be pretty stable. It's then the tasks and tools employed that they're hiring to help them accomplish that job that have the potential to get changed over time, right? And so the players involved, the task tools, those are things that could change and could be more or less important. And so I think that we looked and said, okay, has the world fundamentally changed around us in these areas, which we first looked at and would have made major adjustments had that been the case. And then the second is, let's assume that we need to continue to be really lean for an extended period of time. And the way to stay lean is to control your expenses, number one.
Yep. And
number two is to get to revenue faster.
Yeah.
Right. It's again, there's not one way. You can cut your expenses. We could go to zero, but if we don't ever create something of value that the market's going to pay for, then it sort of doesn't matter. You're just wasting time. And so
are you looking for profitability at that early stage, or is it more symbolic revenue that would allow investors to become interested?
Yeah. To us, it's about getting to revenue faster. And, as an example, it's that whole idea of like, first you got to show that you're building something of value that people are willing to pay for. This idea of optimizing to profitability often is something that you should be really thinking about later. And, you want to look at things like cost of sales and cost of customer service or success. And there are big buckets that you want to have a general sense of, but when you're getting your first customer is usually really, really expensive.
Right.
And that's okay. That isn't something you need to optimize out of the gate.
Yeah.
Now you want to make sure that you have at least a sense that you could get to a acquisition cost that has a payback period that makes sense and could increasingly make sense over time. And again, that acquisition cost has a certain relevance depending on the lifetime value of the customer, which you may or may not have a good handle on at those rows. So those are, again, things that I try to establish some sense of baseline on, but you don't necessarily need to optimize. And that again is one of those areas that I find many founders focus on too early. Like, oh, we need to swap out this tool or this vendor for this one because we're going to save costs. And it doesn't matter when the numbers are so small.
Sure.
It's more about getting the early machinery in place to start turning so that you see that there is a real business. And part of that is getting to revenue. And so to your point, I think that in our mind is what will make you potentially attractive down the line when and if you need to raise more capital.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense, which is a totally different game than a business that's established, that's been around, that's just trying to make it. Maybe they have a lot of overhead, right? I mean, it's just night and day from a strategy standpoint. So there's some would-be founders listening. They're looking at ideas, they're looking at markets, they recognize that not only is this a time of crisis, but it's a time of opportunity. And so have you been able to identify any sectors, any concepts that are new opportunities, or that you can maybe even predict, like, okay, this is actually going to accelerate? We've all seen how online meetings and the opportunity around those have now been accelerated. I have a client that's in the medical space, and the 2-year horizon was, we need to be doing telemedicine, but now we need it now, and it is now, and it's the quickest pivot that anybody could have ever imagined. And so, where are you seeing some of these potential opportunities show up? Maybe in the sectors that you're involved in, and where do you think some of these shifts are going to be a little bit more permanent than ephemeral?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So there are a few that I've been thinking about. One, you mentioned it. So this idea of healthcare technology, not life science, is an area that I think has been this pent-up demand for a long, long time. And, I had a friend in telemedicine who he exploded over the last 2 months in customer acquisition and usage, and, has had an easy time raising capital now, where he had struggled for the last year, because people see, oh, this is a real thing. And so I see platforms like that continuing to do pretty well. And then you start looking on top of that and saying, okay, what are the other technologies that need to get intertwined in or integrated in so that doctors can do more things in a telemedicine way, whether that's diagnostics or different alternative ways of doing data collection, data analysis. This idea that I'm seeing it in even people exploring ways to do clinical trials differently. And so I think all throughout that, how do we finally use technology in the healthcare industry throughout its life cycle? And that, software is eating the world everywhere. But if you think about, a lot of the healthcare industry is not connected, right? These are in theory, a bunch of IoT types of nodes that should be producing, collecting, and using data. And again, now you have to start looking at things like compliance and privacy and all these other things, but it should be able to make us collectively way more intelligent, way more effective. And I think we'll start to see this personalized medicine reality appear much faster than before. So that's an area that I think is interesting. It's not an area I have a ton of expertise in, but I see a lot of opportunity. And I frankly see a lot here in this area. I think we have a lot of the pieces to really do that well here in Southern California. Another one that I grew up in retail, and my family had a retail family business that lasted almost 150 years. So my career trajectory has been very different than what I grew up in. But I have a real heart for the local merchant and for retail, because that was what my family did for so many generations. I think the reality of we as humans needing to be amongst other humans is still very real. I do believe we're meant to be in community. We need to physically be together to be fully sort of energized in the way that we were built. And so it's going to take a long time for the change for us all to be isolated, virtual, to really set in. I feel a different level of fatigue from virtual conversations.
Yeah.
But with all that said, I think we are going to increasingly see more mobile retail. I think we're going to see that as a physical store, you're going to have to greatly increase the experience bar to get me to come to you.
Yeah.
And so this idea of how to do things, why I can't walk out of my front door and walk into a mobile store more easily, I think is going to continue to evolve, especially in areas that have a density like we have here and in other places. So I think that there is going to continue to be a shift and a need for enabling capabilities there. And so, those are a couple, and there certainly are others that we're thinking about, but hopefully, a couple ideas there.
I've got more to go into, but Carey, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back with more with Carey Ransom.
From a very young age, I remember in 6th grade being taught in sex education that an abortion is just a woman's choice, and that's it. That's the only thing they teach you. It's not a baby. It's part of the woman's body, and she gets to decide whether it lives or dies. I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, in a very Catholic and supportive family.
My husband and I, Jerry, have 5 children. Veronica is the youngest. And I always told her, I know God has great plans for you. I had always told her that. In high school and even junior high, she had lots of struggles with anxiety and depression and problems in school.
I would just not want to get out of bed. I had no motivation to do schoolwork or be around family or friends. I kind of secluded myself in my room. It was Christmas Day of 2018. I was 16 years old. My boyfriend was 18 at the time. We had been dating for about 4 months. I felt that something was off with me, so I looked up some symptoms online and it was matching up with pregnancy. I went to the store to get the pregnancy tests, went home, I took one, and almost immediately the second line came up, which means that you're pregnant. I was just in disbelief at first. I was like, no way, I'm not pregnant, not me. A couple hours later, I took another one, and also was positive. I have a very close relationship with my mother, so I decided to tell her first. I went up to her and I showed her the tests, and she had already had a feeling that I was pregnant because I was acting differently than I usually do.
I was a little bit shocked, but I knew that I would support her. We definitely have always been pro-life, and I knew without a doubt I would never want Veronica to have an abortion.
My boyfriend told me he wanted me to have an abortion. His first reaction was just that he was very afraid. I understood where he was coming from because I was afraid as well. I knew that he wanted me to have an abortion, and I felt pressured to do so just because I didn't want to ruin his life or alter his life in a big way when it's not something that he wanted. I actually went down to Planned Parenthood. I was put in a room with this woman, and instead of her talking to me about my options or resources or different ways I could get help, it felt like she was a salesperson and she was trying to sell me on abortion. That just didn't sit right with me, and I knew that that wasn't the place I needed to be, and that's when I went home and did my own research. I searched on YouTube, what is an abortion, and I came across Live Action's video where the doctor describes in detail at each stage of pregnancy how the baby is killed. I just felt so upset and sad after I saw that video. I just cried. I knew if I hadn't found that video, that might have been my son who was being described in the abortion procedures, and I might have gone through with something without knowing what I was truly doing. I knew that he was a person, and that he was alive, and that killing him at any stage of life would be wrong.
The truth is powerful, and I'm so glad she came across that.
My boyfriend saw that video also, and it moved us both, and we knew that we couldn't do that. My baby was over 9 pounds, so I had to have a C-section. They brought me in, and it was about a 30-minute process. The moment I heard him cry, I was just like, I couldn't believe it, and I was so emotional because it felt like it was a blessing that he was there, and I could have almost taken his life away, and I was just so happy to hear his voice. That's a moment I'll never forget, and I just feel blessed to be his mom. I think a lot of women do choose abortion because they're afraid of the lack of support, and also I think they're just uneducated and not completely aware of what they're doing. Your pregnancy isn't just a blob of cells, it is a human being, and it deserves to live. Don't be afraid. There's so many resources out there that can help you if you are pregnant. I had my boyfriend there with me. He's been a great dad. He's really stepped up. I've been helped by people who I didn't even know existed. I'm really thankful that I found that video and that I found the resources I did and that I have my son. He really saved my life.
Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today has been Carey Ransom of OC4 Venture Studio, and we've been talking about the market. We've been talking about products, about market-driven products, about opportunities that have emerged, and what that is going to continue to look like for small businesses and entrepreneurs in this kind of COVID and post-COVID era. And Carey, offline, we were just talking about, continuing to talk about retail and how retail is shifting, of course. And retail is, some people may be thinking, is retail dead? Will South Coast Plaza reopen? And when it does, what does it look like? And even, we talked about like this vending machine idea. Maybe we could jump into that. And what does it look like for brick and mortar in this sort of post-Amazon Go, post-COVID environment, and where a customer experience expectation has been set and influenced by the Amazons of the world? How does that all kind of come together as we move forward in a world where we've had to get very, very comfortable with technology by way of commerce, in not only e-commerce, but all of commerce, because that's all we have right now. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that. How do you see the world in that sense?
So I do. I think a time like this, in many cases, we kind of revert to Maslow's hierarchy and simplify things, and so we sort of reevaluate, like, what are the most important things, because we retrench into somewhat of a survival mode. And so I think if we were to look right now, we're going to see that a lot of people have eliminated the experimental discovery elements of their brain, or lessened them in this era right now, and they're reverting back to the basics and
survive and thrive
habits. That's right. And so if you think about me going to the grocery store right now as an example, like, I put my head down, I get the 6 things on my list, and I'm in and out of there. And I'm not just wandering around exploring and discovering,
right?
Shopping, if you will. And so I think that makes it challenging if you're trying to launch new ideas, new products in an environment like we're in right now. But we want to experience new things. We want to try new things. And as I was saying, I think the bar of that potential experience is going to get raised. So I don't actually worry about places like South Coast Plaza or things that are true destination type experiences. I think the Disneys of the world are going to be fine because they provide this world class and really outsized experience. They are true experience economy. And I think that what you're going to find is that, the people that are going to thrive in a brick and mortar future are going to be very, very effective at design. It's going to be probably multi-channel type of experience. I have a friend who has this whole concept of think like an app, in challenging local businesses to think more about this end-to-end customer experience that may not just be when they set foot in your store to when they leave, that you can really interact with them throughout, and you can provide them more information and a more personalized experience like they may get from an app that they are relying on today. And so that to me is about designing experiences that really enhance the person and their life. So I think those types of things are going to be where we end up, and how that looks. It could look like a scenario where I have a preference to come to you and I want to continue to do that, but you may also need to have a mobile version of that. And I look at my car that I have now, they do mobile service for me. So they come to me at my house or at my office to fix stuff, unless it gets to a certain level that it has to come into. And so they've really gradated the set of service to not just be this binary, either it's working or you have to bring it into the shop.
Right.
That there is a different set. You could have remote diagnostics, you could have, we'll dispatch somebody out to you. And so I think that to me is what I see the future of a lot of these things, is that we're using information and data much more effectively, and then the solution has and embraces the different options that might be available to make people's lives easier, better, et cetera.
That just makes me wonder about you talked about your family having owned a retail location for, I think you said over 100 years, which is phenomenal. These aren't families that are coming out of Silicon Valley, right? They're in a small community or a small town, or even in somewhere like Orange County or LA. But it's the family Subway or the dry cleaner shop, or it's just something on Main Street, and there's a trade involved, and it gets passed down from one generation to the next, and yet we know that the big business is creeping down market. We were just talking about Trio Rewards and that whole platform, and I think one of the interesting perspectives that product brings to bear is the fact that even though, there's this mom and pop experience, the consumer expectation is it needs to be savvy. If I'm waiting for longer than 2 seconds for anything, I'm already getting impatient. You don't have mom and pop store, you don't have an R&D budget to go create some awesome experience app, right? So now what do? As a mom and pop place, as a retail place, you need to have an answer for that customer experience expectation that's now been set by the Amazons of the world as they've come down market, as they're equipping consumers with the most streamlined, easiest, expedited customer experience. So, I just wonder about, your car, like is Joe's, auto shop, like what does Joe's auto shop do when a Tesla needs service? Like, is he servicing Teslas, or like, how does he adapt to that environment where the model has now shifted, and that business that would be coming, in 10 years when your Tesla's old? What does he do then?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, a lot of people, auto service is a particularly interesting one to me, because I feel like that is a market space that has been ripe for some amount of disruption for a long time, and yet very little has actually happened there.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have assessed it, studied it. It's a huge, what I call information asymmetry problem, where
Sure.
I, as the consumer, know far less about my vehicle than this person that I'm handing it off to fix it. So, I don't understand how they diagnose it. Right. How do I know whether they did it right? I don't know.
They have all the control. They have all
the right things. Yeah. And I think those tend to be markets that take longer to disrupt, but ultimately they do, because information tends to equalize in the marketplace to the extent it can.
Well, just look at purchasing an auto, right? What the difference now between buying a car versus 15, 20 years ago, the power is now in the hands of the consumer. I can go shop the market and get a bidding war going on out there before even stepping into a showroom.
Mm-hmm. And so I think you will see, I don't know if it'll be bidding war per se, but I think you will see, similar to the, the idea of think like an app. I have a bunch of components in my vehicle that really should be sensors that can talk to me. And we see some of that now. I get constant air pressure readings on my tires. So, very soon it probably is going to start sharing more information than just air pressure. And all of these things can get increasingly smarter, which then makes me smarter and helps increase the safety, increase the customer experience, to me knowing that this is performing at the level that it should. And so those to me are the kinds of equalizing opportunities where we will have a much better sense of what needs to be done, by whom, where, how. And so I do see this need, if you will, for the auto mechanics. And I think they really have stepped up their game to be much smarter on one hand from a diagnostic and data interpretation standpoint. But those are also things that I would say in many cases machines are going to be able to do in a much more objective way. And so even this adaptability element, I think, is one of the most critical skills that we as humans that we tend to possess, this natural adaptability, but training ourselves to become more agile and adaptive is another key set of skills that I think we have to continue to hone.
We've been talking about problems and solutions, things in the market that need to be fixed and products, and we've kind of been looking at it from both angles. In the scenario of the car, is there an opportunity for a startup to come in and say, I'm just going to create a diagnostic station, and you come in and you pay me $100, you plug your car in, and then you're going to get bids from 5 different garages around town that are going to tell you they're going to bid on fixing whatever that thing is to put the power back in your hands. I mean, that was just shooting from the hip.
Yeah, and there could, that's an unbundling of the structure, right? And so what I think we see happening in a lot of markets is you'll see this unbundling happen and then sort of a reconnection. And so, this idea of a marketplace like that, I think is a totally viable one. You've seen it in other home service categories. I need to have somebody come out and do something at my home. To the extent I can sort of quote unquote diagnose or describe what that is, the more that starts to look like a product, the more then I can have more power in getting the right kinds of pricing. And that, I think that's where more intelligence in elements of our life will help productize those things in a more objective way.
And like we were saying, the data side of all of this, maybe it's everything. I mean, data is the new oil, right? Is what they say. And in some sense, data can augment or inform an existing product, but in another sense, data maybe even is the product. And so do you, when looking at these opportunities, look at data as the product or data as augmentation or in support of to enhance or optimize the product? Or are you looking at both? You sound really interested in the data aspect. I'm just curious of your perspective.
We think data is key. Data could be the product. Data could be augmentative to the product in enhancing its value. Data could be exhaust that is sort of coming off and could be used as a separate business altogether or a separate revenue stream. So it really depends but I think in general the answer is yes.
Yeah. As we kind of turn the corner here, we're all interested in helping the recovery, not only for our sakes, but for the sake of our community. I sense in you a real heart just for the business owner, the entrepreneur, not only from a typical investor and ROI and exit standpoint, but the sense I get from you is that you care a lot about the journey. You care a lot about the impact to families and communities and the risks that entrepreneurs take, and how do we get them from A to B to C and grow people. What are you thinking about, and what are you guys doing at your studio to help your portfolio thrive and position for a positive reopen? What does that look like?
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, in our case, a lot of these companies aren't yet in what I would even characterize as in business.
Sure.
Right. I sort of think of the startup world that I tend to live in is this, problem to solution to somebody willing to pay you. Now you actually have the beginnings of a business where they're paying you to ultimately building a company that has mission, vision, values, and a culture, and this real idea to build long-lasting impact in the world and move the world forward in a positive way. And so we really try and help orient them on that journey, not to maybe get too far ahead of themselves, not to worry about things or get distracted by things that just aren't critical yet. And so some of that is about prioritizing, and as I mentioned earlier, creating much more predictability of the success. And some of it's also about the human. You just can't, it's easy to get overwhelmed when you have 100 decisions sitting in front of you, and really helping people feel that sense of calm and support along the way. And it's a challenge, right? I always say, the outcome is really hard to forecast. So you better really embrace the journey. And that's why, being in love with the problem, being in love with that customer is so key, because those are the things that will center you back to, we've got to keep going. We have to band together. We have to rally. And so I think that's, a big part of the driver for me and our team. And I think even a lot of the entrepreneurs that we work with is about changing the culture and really, reminding ourselves that, going and solving a hard problem in a new way and putting it on the line to do that is really noble. And this idea of being an entrepreneur and wanting to really do it their way, with this idea of like, I'm going to stake my claim and do it my way and be independent is a really, I think, a noble and exciting thing. And we should, as a society, we should be appreciating and encouraging and supporting that, because that does lead to the things that make our lives better in many cases. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And we should be just as appreciative of the person who gave it their all and didn't succeed as the ones who do. And those experiences are really what unlock us as humans. And I think those are the kinds of things that we don't talk enough about and we don't celebrate. And that those are the things that we care a ton about, and how to grow as human beings in every area of our life. But that in this business side is a place where we can have just such dramatic impact. And, as one of my friends says, this idea of the corporation is a really fascinating thing that has been invented in humanity. And when it really starts to take off, this, if you look at something, Amazon is this monstrous example of it today, that has been able to have incredible impact in the world in saving us tremendous amounts of time and money that then can be deployed into other areas. So, those are all things that I think we need to be more explicitly talking about and looking for ways to continue to evolve and innovate around. And that's the kind of culture and environment that I want more of in this area.
Mm-hmm. There is something very heroic, I think, and that's not too strong of a word, about the entrepreneur. I'm going to butcher the quote, but I think it's attributed to Teddy Roosevelt, where he's talking about, hey, the credit doesn't go to the person on the outside in the bleachers that is critiquing what's going on in the arena. The credit goes to the guy that's got the sand in his face and the sweat on his brow, and he's going after it. And I think it is heroic, and the amount that entrepreneurs have to put on the line to pursue their dreams. It's called a venture for a reason. It's called an adventure, right? Like there's dragons and there's bottomless pits and yet there's the holy grails on the other side. So it's I think it's a really beautiful picture. Tell us, as we kind of close out here. How do we learn more about OC Venture Studio and even specifically your location? I think you're in Costa Mesa, right? Yeah. There's some I think strategy behind that as well. But what are you offering, and how can people learn more?
Sure. So you can find us online, oc4v.com. We're pretty active in social media like LinkedIn. We have a whole array of different events. We were doing a lot of in-person events before we were forced to really go virtual, and we've really even increased the number of virtual events and things that we're doing. Many of them are just broadly available to the community. So if you're a curious, maybe I'm interested in potentially being an entrepreneur, or I'm interested in potentially helping out entrepreneurs in the area, we are, as you said, we're based in Costa Mesa. We're really rooted in Orange County with a focus on Southern California. And the way that we think about it is we continue to build out around the studio all of the capabilities that we believe we would need to start, launch, and grow a high impact, growth venture type of business in a data-centric SaaS type of business category or business. And we have that all available to partner with entrepreneurs. So whatever they need, we either have it resident in the studio in our team or really at our fingertips. And we think that's a critical part of the value to helping increase their odds of success. And this is an area that needs to taste more outsized success, needs to have more winners, and more winners will breed more winners. That's what's happened in other markets. And we want to really help other people greatly succeed. And I think that's where we see such strong alignment between what we're trying to do as we think of ourselves as operators first, investors second, but that we bring those two together to try to make it faster and easier for others here too.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Carey, thank you for what you're doing for the community. And that is how I look at it. This country is made up of entrepreneurs and small businesses, and that's how we put food on the table. That's how we send our kids to college. That's how we solve, huge problems that are facing humanity. And I think it's the lifeblood of our community. And so I appreciate your contribution to that, your heart for the early stage folks who haven't posted the revenue, and you're willing to come alongside them to coach them, help them, show them, help operate, put some cash into the business and grow them. And so just grateful that you and your peers in the market are doing that, because we need it, especially now, especially post-COVID. We need it now in the recovery. And just grateful for you and grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure, Kevin, and excited to see the journey ahead for you with the show. So great to be here, and thanks for letting me share.
I hope my interview with Carey Ransom from OC4 Venture Studios was thought-provoking for you, especially if you're looking to create opportunities in this season of crisis. Please give it 5 stars, share it with a friend, and join me for episode 7 with Sanford Coggins from VisionWise Capital, where we get into the state of the real estate market and how to best capture opportunity. We'll see you then.